Briahna, what's on your radar?
Well, Robbie, some simpering, warmongering liberals are getting pretty lost on Ukraine, and it stands to cost them a lot more than just midterms. You see, I got into trouble on Monday when, on my podcast, Bad Faith, I interviewed a national security expert and former president of Plowshares Fund, Joe Cirincione, about his critique of the now infamous Congressional Progressive Caucus letter. In my eyes, the letter offered a mere glimmer of hope that the left wasn't going to completely concede its anti-war bona fides to the right, but Joe saw it differently, tweeting, "This isn't about the left or a rejection of diplomacy. It is about a very small group with a very specific idea of how to force Ukraine to end the war. This is not diplomacy. It is great power politics." What Representative Raskin today called a, quote, colonial reflex. Now, of course, nothing in the CPC letter articulated a specific idea of how to end the war, and it certainly didn't force Ukraine to end it on any timeline or under any specific conditions. In fact, the letter lauded Joe Biden's approach to the war and the billions in appropriations Biden has sent via the Ukraine relief packages. But that didn't stop liberals from completely melting down. As a Vox write-up explained, even as many journalists and experts pointed out that much of the letter's contents echoed parts of President Joe Biden's own rhetoric or were otherwise anodyne, international affairs professor and Vox contributor Daniel Drinzer called it a giant nothing burger. Critics piled on the members of Congress on social media and picked apart every word of it. And so, the courageous progressive lions at the CPC stuck to their guns and LOL, just kidding. Caucus leader Pramila Jayapal offered a correction before ultimately retracting the letter the next day. It was a pathetic move that led Tulsi Gabbard to say this completely, unimpeachably true statement on Tucker Carlson last week.
These so-called progressives did a very simple thing that apparently can appear to be brave in Washington these days. In that letter to President Biden, they just told the truth about how this ongoing proxy war with Russia is increasing in cost and consequences, both on the Ukrainian people, but also the American people here at home, and how it's negatively impacting gas prices, increasing inflation, and so on. These progressives in the letter, they didn't say stop sending aid to Ukraine now. All they said was, hey, President Biden, engage in diplomacy. And the response they got, of course, from the warmongers who control the Democrat Party in Washington was to immediately be smashed to pieces, so much so that these Democrat members of Congress cowered in the corner with fear and now have gone so far out of their way, apologizing profusely for having the audacity to call for diplomacy in this war that's putting us all at risk. And now they've actually gone 180 degrees in the opposite direction. They're now trying to prove how much of a warmongers they too are by saying, no, don't engage in diplomacy. We don't want you to do that. This is exactly, Tucker, one of the main reasons I left the Democrat Party. They are completely controlled by these warmongers in Washington. They don't really care about the Ukrainian people. Otherwise, they would have engaged in diplomacy many, many months ago.
Now, I certainly disagree with Tulsi on plenty of things, but in that clip, I saw no lie. And because I respect Joe Cirincione and am confident enough in my views and my intellect to engage with people who disagree with me, I invited him onto my podcast to discuss it with me. Here's how he responded to the Tulsi clip when I played it for him.
If you really believed, like I do and have been arguing for weeks, that Democrats are setting Tulsi up to make that exact argument, I can't be mad at Tulsi. Tulsi didn't say a single untrue thing there.
Are you kidding me? It's one lie after the other. What are you talking about?
Name a lie.
Warmongers. Warmongers. The Democratic Party is controlled by warmongers?
We're leftists. We obviously know and believe that the Democratic Party is controlled by warmongers. The deep state knows no D or our party affiliation. Wait, this is like not even a controversial statement.
She even lies about the name of the party. The whole point of why we loved Bernie Sanders. She calls it the Democrat.
He had an issue with her calling the Democrat Party like that was the real central concern here on the hearts and minds of Americans. Now, look, the interview was tough but cordial, and we ended very warmly and on good terms. However, the next day on Twitter, Joe decided that he wasn't a fan of how people responded to his own words. And he accused me of, quote, weaponizing clips of him talking in our interview to, quote, attack him. He even threatened to abandon Twitter, opining that, quote, Musk's control will make it even worse. Moreover, he said that I, quote, encourage supporters to post hundreds of insults and smears without correction. Now, I sincerely regret that he feels that way. I really did enjoy talking to Joe both times he came on my podcast. But here's the hard truth. Those insults and smears weren't encouraged by me. They were totally organic. People just hated his take. And here's why. Joe engaged in uncritical support for Pramila Jayapal, whom he described as a, quote, great progressive leader, even though she bungled the $15 minimum wage, the Nina Turner endorsement, and the Build Back Better bifurcation. He described Zelensky as, quote, one of the greatest leaders we've seen in a long time, and many of his comments came off as canned and almost jingoistic. He accepted the CPC's narrative that the letter was a staff mistake, and even though Representative Ro Khanna has publicly rejected that claim and stood by the letter, and even though blaming subordinates reflects incredibly poorly on leadership, he kept doing so. But most importantly, Joe struggled to answer one fundamental question. What assurances are there that U.S. aid is motivated by a humanitarian drive toward peace rather than military adventurism, especially after it was reported back in May that then Prime Minister Boris Johnson undermined peace talks? Given the United States' actions in Libya, where thanks to NATO intervention, there are now slave markets, Afghanistan, which we occupied for 20 years, and Iraq, which we invaded on false pretenses and killed 1 million people, I think it's a reasonable question. Russia has violated international law by invading Ukraine. But given America's past behavior, what assurances can experts like Joe give us that the U.S.'s role here isn't pretextual? That was my only question. And I think it's a particularly necessary question, given that America regularly ignores humanitarian causes like the genocide in Rwanda or Bosnia. And since our own president and State Department officials keep saying that their goal is to weaken Russia, a goal that is not quite the same as protecting Ukrainian people or its borders. Here's how I put it to Joe.
They're stealing Ukrainian children. 500 just yesterday were shipped to Russia. And this is why we should be supporting them. We cannot allow this kind of evil to go unchecked, just on a basic moral reason. I mean, don't you agree with that?
I'm sorry, I don't. And here's why.
Why?
There are gangs that have overtaken Haiti. There is a cholera pandemic that was started by the UN. UN members raped Haitians. A third of Pakistan was underwater. Should we go, due to the climate crisis, should we go and invade China because Uyghurs are in concentration camps? Tell me, articulate. And this is the question that I asked Matt Duss when this war first started. Until you can articulate to me what the rationale is behind where America intervenes and where it doesn't, and give me some kind of moral accounting that makes me believe that it's actually about moral commitments and realizing how much of our money and our resources in the richest country in the world can go to saving lives and increasing the quality of life for the most people, as opposed to a strategic military intervention for territory, resources, and political control. If you can articulate to me why this is truly the most deserving humanitarian case on the planet, as opposed to a continuation of these Cold War policies, we want our economic system, our oppressive, by the way, economic system to maintain global dominance, then I can start to entertain a conversation about what our intervention should be, how long, and how much.
Now, you can watch a free 30-minute clip of that interview over at the Bad Faith YouTube channel or subscribe on Patreon to watch the whole thing. But for now, you'll have to trust me when I say he never offered a satisfactory explanation, at least not in my view. As you heard, he attempted to use abuses against children, an emotional ploy so common and trite that it's literally a meme, to shame me into dropping my legitimate concerns. And although many blue checks are at this very moment accusing me of rolling my eyes at genocide, I was in fact rolling my eyes at Joe using such a cliched argument to avoid the fundamental question. Why save these women, these children, but not these ones? Now, it's worth noting that some fact checkers have disputed Joe's account of kidnapped Ukrainian children, but even if we accept it on its face, as I did in the interview, and as much as my heart aches for human suffering everywhere, a humanitarian crisis in Ukraine does not get to the question of why and to what extent America should play the world's policeman. And if it does adopt the role as global cop, why are we only choosing to police certain neighborhoods? 2.2 million Yemeni children under the age of 5 are starving right now as a result of a Saudi-backed war. The United States has sent $4.5 billion in humanitarian aid to Yemen since the beginning of the conflict 7 years ago. Compare that to the $40 billion aid package that went out the door earlier this year. And while words like evil are used frequently to describe Putin, Saudi princes are apparently off the hook. Joe Biden flew to Saudi Arabia to fist bump the architect of the tragedy in Yemen and beg him for oil so that Biden could keep control of Congress. This is an article from September. Did you even know that 500,000 children are at risk of dying in Somalia from hunger? The selective outrage is deafening. I will say this, when pushed, some people, including Joe, offer up a rationale that is closer to the truth. Joe argued that America must be involved in this conflict to protect the, quote, geopolitical global order, saying, quote, you cannot allow a nation by force to change the boundaries of Europe. You haven't seen that since the end of World War II. Well, I think Palestine might have a little something to say about who we allow to change borders, but in fairness to Joe, he did specify Europe for some reason that I'll decline to interrogate here. Still, I'm old enough to remember the breakup of Yugoslavia. Borders do change, even in Europe. The reason being that they were poorly drawn borders that failed to accommodate the ethnic tensions and allegiances of the region in the first place. Sound familiar? Now, again, I have not said a thing about what I think Ukrainians should do. Remember, this whole conversation was about me defending a letter that generically said, hey, give peace a chance. Not one that says Ukraine must give up the Donbass to Russia. But despite this mild pushback against the war machine, Democrats have accused me of being an isolationist and a subhuman fascist. They've accused me of, quote, promoting genocide and wanting inaction on Ukraine. Former Ukraine ambassador to Austria called me a reptile for, again, simply asking what the end game was to a conflict we should all hope will end. Another former Ukrainian ambassador described me as embodying the banality of evil. And one user posted this image. Well, I'll leave you to interpret what exactly that's all about. All this for defending a letter that stated the obvious. The goal here should be peace. And this is where Joe gave the game away.
One of the points of the letter is they want the U.S. to negotiate a ceasefire.
Well, eventually, doesn't everybody want there to be a ceasefire? Doesn't everybody want there to be the end of the war?
Yes, but then you go to the end of the letter and it says this is the primary aim of U.S. policy should be to end this war.
Should it not be?
If it's wrong to simply ask about the path to peace, what hope should we have that the State Department, with its incentives to invest in war, will work toward that end? Fighting to the last Ukrainian is what Russia said it wants. And while I suspect some Ukrainians might not love a plan that would put them all in the ground, it doesn't bother the blob. It's not their lives at stake, not their kids dying in the war. This is the critical point. Ukraine is not going to militarily defeat Russia. This should not come as a shock to you. Russia is a nuclear-capable superpower. Ukraine is not. Here's former Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General, Jeffrey Sachs, on this very point.
Because the United States seems militarily to believe that they will defeat Russia. Russia is a country with considerable firepower, to say the least, and with 1,800 active nuclear warheads. And so all of this talk of defeating Russia, to my mind, is reckless. But at my age, I'm 67, I've lived through decades of reckless U.S. foreign policy, U.S. bravado, and I'm afraid that we're at it again.
This is why it makes no sense to say that America has no right to weigh in on the end of this conflict. In fact, that framing actually is all wrong. It seems obvious that Americans have a right to weigh in on where their money is going. And yet I've seen the following argument all over the place. Why do some Americans think that they're so special and unique that we have an obligation to prove anything to them / convince them? Self-obsessed and selfish much? I'm sorry, but the world doesn't revolve around you, said one tweet. Man, it's literally our tax dollars. And if you don't want any input on how you fight Russia, I totally get it. America has certainly done enough meddling in Ukraine for a lifetime. But now that U.S. money is involved, you can't treat the possible end or diminishment of U.S. aid as coercive in and of itself. When Democrats do this, they give Kevin McCarthy license to credibly argue that Democrats are presenting Ukraine a blank check. What else can you call it if discussing any prospective limit or on U.S. aid gets you named a genocide denier? Again, at no point did I or the CPC letter actually say that aid should be withdrawn. But if asking questions about a diplomatic plan to end the war makes Democrats call you a vile you-know-what, is there any wonder that the right is seen as a more hospitable place for a peace movement?
Someone just tweeted at me that I should stop tweeting while you're doing your radar because I need to pay attention to. But I agree with everything you're saying, so I don't have a substantive comment. No, I think you did a great job in that interview. Always, kudos to you for wanting to engage with people who have different perspectives. Right? I don't agree with that guy's perspective at all. I think our viewers know that. And he's just, I think, embarrassed that he didn't acquit himself particularly well. I mean, he failed to articulate a rationale. You got to and he absolutely tried to do the moralizing, oh, well, you care about the children dying or being kidnapped. And then, as you point out, well, if the standard is the U.S. government must intervene or give aid to help people stop unfortunate deaths of children, then we're going to be involved all over the world. And also, we have caused the deaths of children through our drone wars and our regime change.
Absolutely.
So it's clearly not humanitarian. It's something else. We're pretending it's a humanitarian, but that's false.
Just be honest about it.
Right. He could have been honest about it. He could have said this is, again, as I've said before, a strategic priority for the U.S. And then we can have a conversation about whether that is true, whether this is a legitimate strategic priority of the U.S., whether the U.S. people agree that it's a legitimate
and that's the key point. I'm very sensitive to the idea that America shouldn't be meddling, that America shouldn't decide for Ukraine how it ends its war, etc. But there's this weird thing that's happened where if you even bring up peace, the implication being at some point the aid spigot is going to turn off if they're no longer fighting, then withdrawing funds is literally characterized as dictating Ukrainian policy. And look, the fundamental question here that no one's really talking about, the real problem is there is not an independently mass-funded peace organization that can intervene without the implicit directives coming with the country that's paying for it, right? There is no, alien from the sky that can come down and just adjudicate these kind of disputes. So whenever there's aid, there's going to be strings attached. And frankly, America has used its aid, these international aid organizations, to be incredibly manipulative all over the world, disrupting economies. Many countries in Africa are very upset right now about the grain crisis that's impending as a consequence of this war that they had nothing to do with. But this is the reality that we're in now. And it cannot be the case that we can't even have a conversation about peace, because any implication that we drop aid by even a penny or make it contingent on anything at all is somehow doing imperialism. It's imperialism if we act, it's imperialism if we don't act.
It would be contrary to the practices of governments for 2,000 years and before. It never has it been the case that we can go to medieval history, we can go to ancient history. No government or quasi-government organization just gives money to some cause without wanting something in return or wanting to attach some strings to it. The reason they do that is that is what diplomacy is. Diplomacy is trying to get countries to act in our interests, and we have a variety of tools to have them do that. There can be war, there can be aid, there can be trade, there can be sanctions.
There's all kinds of things that
all
happen.
sorts of things, but it's not. The point is to get more of what we want.
Yeah, let's just be honest about it. And again, I don't approve of all of most of those things, not all of those things.
But what we want here is peace.
What we want here is peace.
So let's attach a requirement eventually that they sit down and work it out.
There should not be heavy sighs when I say, isn't the goal peace? I think that we're in a really dangerous place at that point. But people can check out the interview in full. I'm not hiding a ball here. Thank you. I appreciate that, Robbie. We'll have more Rising for you after this.